Hey everyone, Tactics here, and today I wanted to highlight some of the interesting, powerful, and very rare loot available to tank players in the first season of The War Within, including things like trinkets, weapons, and jewelry, even with some special effects. I'm going to be focusing here on the Raid and Mythic Plus loot specifically. However, it is somewhat relevant to at least note that world trinkets, including things from, world quests and stuff like that, are now actually available up on the hero track if you do manage to get lucky and hit one in your Great Vault on the delve part. Now, of course, that has a relatively low chance to actually do that, and the hero track specifically is a bit less relevant with the buffs to the myth track, so I'm going to skip on those specific trinkets, but be aware of that just for the sake of brevity. Wanted to get through this relatively quickly. Now, I say that, but before getting into the trinkets and all that stuff themselves, I did want to briefly talk about a pretty significant adjustment for tanks and healers specifically going into the War Within, as Blizzard has decided to put a flat 33% reduction on all cantrip items and damage trinkets for those roles specifically, with their stated goal being that they wanted to be able to tune those trinkets specifically for DPS players without worrying about the impact on healers and tanks, and at the same time making it feel less bad to select options more assigned to those roles that enhance the defenses of tanks, the healing output of healers. For example, I've mentioned this in a few of my previous videos, kind of briefly talked about it, so let's go fully into this topic in this video, seeing as it is the trinkets video. Now, in general, I actually have no issues with this philosophy, but my worry when this post kind of initially came out was that historically there haven't been a lot of good tank trinkets, right? If you look at the last couple expansions, even most recently we had Ferox Rageheart, which was so good even some DPS and healers were using it, but outside of that you kind of have to go back pretty far before you get like a decent number of good ones, like Sanctum of Domination. I think there was the Defense Matrix, and there was the Aegis that I can remember from there. Maybe I'm missing some in there, but generally over the course of at least Dragonflight, it's been kind of tough to find good tank-specific trinkets. So if all of a sudden the offensive options that tanks were using are now nerfed, and the chance that you get a good tank trinket is just kind of low if you look at things in recent history, that leaves you in a bit of a weird spot as a tank player, where your options are maybe, you wear the nerfed DPS trinket anyways, because they're still better than the unnerfed tank options, or you just get a bunch of boring stat sticks, which again, in my opinion, is kind of lame. So this was my concern, which was of course said before any in-depth tank trinket testing has been done. And unfortunately, after having done that testing now for, more than a month and waiting for, tank trinket tuning that hasn't really happened. I think it happened like one time. It does appear that we are living in that world with very few decent tank specific options, both in terms of offense and defense. And listen, I'm not saying that tank trinkets need to do like 10% of your damage to be good, because here's the thing. If there were extremely impactful defensive trinkets, you would see tanks use them and not care about the offensive loss. Again, I mentioned the Aegis trinket from back in Sanctum of Domination. That did very, very little damage, but it was so powerful defensively that tanks still opted to use it despite that. If you give tanks powerful options in the defensive category, a lot of times they will opt to use them. Instead, what it's looking like we're actually getting is just some generally mediocre defensive options that have extremely poor damage output. We're talking sub 2%, sometimes sub 1% of your damage done, so you'd rather just wear a DPS trinket, which even after the nerfs is doing like 7% of your damage done, right? So I'd like to see some significant adjustments to the tank trinkets, and maybe that means that they need to put a negative aura on DPS and healers trying to use tank trinkets, just like they did on tanks trying to use DPS trinkets, right? To maybe prevent a Rage Heart situation. And maybe that would make them actually more inclined to make tank trinkets powerful if they're no longer worried about DPS players or healers trying to put them onto. I don't know. What I do know is tank trinkets are kind of in a weird spot on the beta, but we'll go into it now. That's enough rambling. Let's start with the trinkets, I guess. So we will start with the tank specific trinkets here. There are not a lot of on-use ones. There's really these two. Swarmlord's Authority is probably the best tank trinket currently available, specifically if you are a haste user, because this trinket does scale with haste. It does give flat haste, and basically it's a 1-minute CD on use. It spawns a bunch of scarabs, and these guys basically attack monsters and give you this kind of ignore pain type shield where it's absorbing 50% of the damage taken. And like I said, this trinket does get better if you enjoy haste, not only because of the passive haste on it, but also because the on use gives you more scarabs to give you more of this absorb if you have more haste. So if you're a haste tank spec, this is probably a pretty decent defensive option for you. It's not insanely OP, but it is something that you will actually notice as opposed to some of these other tank trinket options. And damage wise, it's abysmal. It's abysmal damage. It's like sub 1%. Maybe if it's like pure single target, it's like sub 2%, but it's almost no damage. So I think I would like to see the damage increased on this trinket, but defensively, this one is in a decent spot. So this is probably the closest to a good tank trinket that you have in this first season, and it's kind of specific again to the haste tanks. This is the other kind of niche potential trinket here. Foul Behemoth's Chelicera. No, this was I believe this is from the raid, the Swarmlord's Authority. The second last boss, if I remember correctly. This is also another raid trinket here. This is the other on-use trinket. This is from the first boss, I believe, so potentially something easier to get. And basically, this puts a 20-second dot on the target, and then your attacks against the target will give you this heal. And if this overheals, it actually gives you permanent health for the rest of combat. So potentially an interesting defensive option, specifically in raid or dungeons where you can never leave combat, or you know, can do the last like 10 minutes without leaving combat or something like that. A little risky, of course, but the real area I see the potential use for this is like a final boss like Queen Ansarek. If that ends up being like a 10-minute boss, an 11-minute boss, this could be very, very useful if the third phase is dangerous. That's a lot of ifs though, right? So, you know, you have to have, you have to stay in combat for like, 8+ minutes, and the last phase has to be the most dangerous part for the tank for this to be relevant. It's giving around 300 to 500k HP per use, depending on how much you actually make use of the overhealing effect, which you should be trying to do, right? So for reference, I am in 610 eye level gear, which is like 28 eye levels off of the cap of gear, and I have 8.3 million health. So you're not gaining a ton of health here per use. Let's say 5% of your health per use. And again, damage wise, this one was doing a little bit more than the Swarmlord's Authority. I think this one was closer to 2%, but still not great, right? This one is just, it's too niche. I think you might actually see people use this in progression. Specifically, again, Queen Ansarek could be a boss fight that is that kind of long enough and scary at the end where you might use this. But again, that's saying this without testing that boss, so who knows? But outside of that kind of niche scenario, there's not a lot of uses for this unless you can find a way to never drop stacks in a dungeon, which is going to be tough. So problem there, if they added like a grace period before your max health disappeared, that could be potential. But again, that would lead to other issues of, your tank now has 20 million, 30 million HP by the end of a dungeon, right? That's kind of weird as well. So it's a tough trinket. Just like design wise, it is interesting. I would say the design of this trinket is good. It is somewhat interesting, but it's just niche, and there's no damage upside if you can't make use of the max health, right? The damage upside is non-existent. So that's the problem with that one. In terms of other defensive tank trinkets here, you've got the Refractory Aggression model. This is from Stone Vault, the dungeon, and this is basically when you taunt, you get an Ignore Pain shield, 50% of the damage taken, and the shield is 1.1 million, and it's a 1-minute cooldown. This is just exceptionally bad in terms of the value it's providing. One, it's on your taunt. Think about this in a raid environment. Most of the time when you're taunting is not when you actually want a defensive press. There is the rare occasion where that is true, like Volcaros, for example. But generally, when you're tanking bosses, you're not in danger the immediate moment that you taunt. So that's one thing. Two, is that the shield is just tiny, right? Like, it's a 1.1 million shield. It essentially, mitigates 2.2 million damage because it's a 50% damage intake. But again, my health is 8.3 million, and I'm 28 eye levels off of the cap. Granted, this is a champion shield, so this number is a bit higher if you're looking at the actual eye level trinket, but still, even then, it's not nearly good enough compared to the health pool that we have, especially after that. The 60% health increase has been active all beta, by the way, just so people are aware. All the testing has been with a 60% health increase, so this number shouldn't be this low, in my opinion. It should be significantly higher, and I don't know, tying it to taunt is rough, right? Tying it to taunt is rough, even in Mythic Plus, because sometimes, maybe early on in a pull, someone gets aggro, you want to rip your taunt, maybe you actually wanted to save this defensive for a tank buster later on, right? So It's not as bad in Mythic Plus because usually having this relatively early in a pull is fine, but forcing you to use your taunt to get it and then you lose aggro on something else, maybe that's tough, right? So, mm, not super big fan of how the effect works, the effect strength, and of course there's no damage here either. And so this, because there is no damage here, the defensive effect should be tuned more, right? Because there shouldn't be taking into effect any like this is dealing a couple percent damage, right, and giving you you know 1.1 million extra health after 3 minutes, right? So this one's just really far behind, in my opinion. Last trinket for defensive stuff, another passive one. This one is from Arakara, I believe. Basically just a passive. You're taking damage, you can retaliate this damage. It deals some nature to them. And while they have that dot, it's also a damage reduction on it. I would, really, really like you to look at the number there. The damage reduction number is 16,000. 16,000. And again, 8.2 million HP. So the numbers on this just need to be cranked way up. The numbers are just really, really down on this trinket. It's just like there's like it does nothing. It does nothing damage wise. It does nothing defensively. It just does nothing. This one needs to be cranked way, way, way up. Not really much else to talk about. Now let's talk about stat sticks then, because this is what probably most tanks are going to be running. Some mix of these stat sticks. Maybe an offensive trinket if you want. Maybe Swarm Lord's Authority if you're a haste spec. But I'm guessing the vast majority of players are going to be using, one of these trinkets here at least. So this one is another, base haste one. So if you like haste, this is a decent option. And basically, doing stuff with your abilities gives you this stacking primary buff for 1 minute, after which it does some damage. This damage is nerfed for tank specifically. This is technically a DPS trinket in that sense, but the damage is kind of irrelevant anyways. It's like 1% damage, right? So again, still kind of competitive with these two damage options, even though it's a nerfed damage trinket, while also giving you haste and primary stat at the same time. If you get lucky, I've gotten the stacks of the primary buff up to like 7. Generally, though, you can kind of assume you're going to have at least 2. So that's pretty solid, honestly, in terms of the stats it's giving you. Then it's also giving you 1% damage, and then it also has the ability to give you more primary as well. Overall, pretty decent trinket again if you like haste. These two are pretty decent combo, I would say. If you're a haste enjoyer, you are missing out on some primary there, but you are getting primary from also having stacks, so not a big deal. This is one that will give you a mix of your highest secondary stat and your primary stat here. Basically, if you stand still, you gain stacks, and if you move, you gain stacks of this separate buff. Standstill one is your primary buff. The moving one is your secondary stat buff, and you have a max of 30 stacks here that you can have based on standing still and moving. So if you have 30 stacks because you stood still for a long time, you start moving, your primary stat buff goes down as you move, but your secondary stat buff goes up. So you can kind of have this, balance of additional secondaries as well as additional primary stats. So this one's pretty good. I think the min max is like you have 20 of the primary stacks and 10 of the secondary, but that just feels very, very tedious and probably excessive to actually keep it up at that level based on movement stuff. So it's decent, something to kind of monitor. But I think, again, generally the sack brood is pretty competitive if your best stat is haste with this trinket, and is not something you really need to worry about min-maxing or anything like that. This one is just really good if you don't like haste specifically, right? If you're a mastery crit or verse enjoyer, this one is obviously the only one that can do that, whereas this specifically is giving you haste in primary. So something there for people that don't enjoy haste. This is a one only for agility tanks. It's meant for, agility and end users. So, your Brewmaster, your Guardian Druid, and your Vengeance Demoner can get this. This is just a random secondary stat. Boom. That's just stat stick. Give you 20 seconds of a stat. Obviously, it's kind of mediocre if you're a tank spec that doesn't like a couple stats like Brewmaster, right? So, not the best option probably, but not horrendous. This one is also an agility one. I don't know why I included this actually, because I don't think any of the agility tanks really want their mastery a ton anymore. It's essentially is another DPS trinket. There is an orb that comes in. You can soak it up, and that gives you mastery buff. If you don't soak it, it does damage to the pack. Obviously, the damage is less than stellar because it's a DPS trinket used by tanks. But if you wanted mastery, this would give you a bunch of mastery on a not horrendous uptime. I think it's a little bit more mastery than this, with a relatively similar uptime if you're actually able to soak the orb, but it's a bit annoying to actually get to the orb and soak it sometimes based on where it spawns. So And again, it's agility only. Strength users aren't going to use it. And with the current state of mastery, I believe none of the agi tanks really want their mastery. So maybe we won't talk about that one. For the strength specific one, this is another haste one. So, hope you like haste, guys. It's also another DPS trinket, so it is partially nerfed for tanks. It deals some split damage and then gives you a haste buff, and it has just some primary stat on it. I generally think you probably wouldn't want to use this too often. It is an option, but like I said, I'm pretty happy with the state of the sack brute if you're a haste enjoyer. And if you're a haste enjoyer, also Stormwind's Authority is pretty decent defensively, while being a bit lacking offensively, but you'd probably want to take a different offensive trinket as opposed to this one, so probably something you're not going to grab. Now, there's also a couple on-use stat trinkets here. Here is a strength one, and again, this is mastery. So basically, you use this, you get a bunch of mastery on a 1.5-minute cooldown, and then outside of that, you do get a bit of a passive mastery boost by killing enemies. So Mythic plus focus here, specifically if you like mastery, which I'm thinking maybe Blood DK does, but again, the value of an on-use trinket like this is kind of hit or miss, so we'll have to see, but this is a potential option here that is not nerfed anyways because it's just pure stats. The other on-use stat trinket here is another haste option. So haste base missing, so 1.5-minute cooldown that gives you just a ton of primary stat, but it does require you to do something. So it's a bit tough to use as a Mythic Plus because there's basically 3 options when you use this trinket. It either puts 3 crystals above your head, you have to jump 3 times, and then it gives you the buff. It'll spawn a little circle on the ground somewhere. You have to go stand in for a couple seconds, and then it gives you the buff. Or it'll spawn an orb somewhere that you have to go run into and pick up, and then it gives you the buff. So there's basically one of 3 things you have to actually do before you get the primary buff. So depending on when you use this, it's not great. Usually, if you actually are doing burst on a 1.5 minute in a raid environment, this is probably pretty good for tanks, because you can usually in a raid environment do these actions. In a Mythic Plus environment, if your circle thing spawns across the pack and there's frontals and stuff in the pack, you can't really get that, right? So something to keep in mind. Probably not gonna use a Mythic Plus, but potentially if you're a haste tank that wants to burst a little bit in raid, it could be a decent option. Now, the two big damage trinkets to talk about here. There's Mad Queen's Mandate. And this one is just blowing everything else out of the water. These are pure DPS trinkets, right? These are 100%, not meant for tanks according to the changes. You're going to get the 33% nerf here on them, but they just do so much, or this one just does so much damage anyways, that you don't really care. It's just basically, you focus a target, you do a cast, boom, just a giant shadow hit. And if they're low enough health, we're talking single digits, sub 5% health, it doesn't quite need to kill them, but it will get CDR on the trinket if you push a target, let's say sub 1% is around where it is, or kill it. So very, very useful in terms of pure damage. And this is, if you want to run a damage trinket as a tank, this is definitely the best option, even if you don't ever get CDR. And that's the thing to note. You can get no CDR ever, and this is still doing 6%, 7% of your damage. This trinket owns. It absolutely cranks, and that's kind of why tanks are still going to be using a damage trinket. This trinket, again, I just kind of wanted to note it, similar to Void Packstone. This is actually based on a set bonus from one of the very rare items, which we'll get to in just a second. The problem is this trinket just kind of sucks all around for DPS players and for tank players, so you actually don't even care about the set bonus. So, don't get baited by this unless you see massive buffs. Obviously, if they buff this trinket, which I assume they will do, because with there being a set bonus, it kind of implies if you're going to grab one piece of the set, you would want both anyways. But currently, that's just not the case. You just kind of ignore the set bonus. So be on the lookout for this getting buffed, but currently it's not worth it, and it is a damage trinket, of course. So it is going to be nerfed for tanks. Those are kind of your trinket options here. That's kind of it. So let's move on and let's talk about the one special weapon option I found through all the actual dungeons in the pool and the raid is this Harvester's Interdiction, which I believe is from Arakara again. And this is a Agi staff, so Brewmasters and Guardian Druids, which is the first mastery, and your melee attacks inflict black blood. So some dot over 3 seconds. Important to note, this was also nerfed. Cantrip weapons were nerfed by 33% for tanks as well. This was doing less than 1% of my damage. It was bonus damage, however, right? So I think it's just kind of free damage. I believe the stat is similar or the same as an eye level weapon that doesn't have an effect. So I think there's no real reason to not take it unless you really don't want those two stats specifically. but generally not as big a deal to not have this weapon either anymore because it's doing so little damage. So something to keep in mind there. Now let's talk very rare stuff. These are all from the raid, from various bosses in the raid. Starting with, I guess this is the last boss. Yeah, so this is a ring from the last boss. Dealing damage has a high chance to grant you this buff. And if you get to 5 stacks of that buff, you do some nature damage over 3 seconds. And if you actually do nature damage yourself, you have a chance to gain additional stacks of that buff. So you'll proc it more often. Again, this damage is reduced for tanks. Very, very high crit, low mastery ring. It is just kind of free damage, like I said, for a lot of people. But again, the damage output was not super high in my experience. We're talking like 1 to 2% again for tanks. So not a ton of damage difference here if you're not going to wear this ring, especially if you do not like stats. There's this neck, really, really good. I think all tanks are probably going to want this neck. Like, you know, there's a lot of haste on it, so maybe if you really hate haste, you don't want it. But basically, if you receive healing from allies, the high chance to restore mana and verse to both of you for 10 seconds. And I want to say this had like a 25+% uptime. So uptime on this is quite good, especially considering it's for you and I guess your healer, right? So it's quite good. It is quite good. Definitely something I think a lot of players are actually, pretty much every player that likes haste is going to want this neck, right? Because that's just free versatility essentially a bunch of the time. And healers are going to like players having this course because they're going to get mana back. So this is a really, really solid neck. Anyone who likes haste is going to be wanting this for sure. There's also this cape here, high crit, low haste. And this basically is you take 25% of your health, you gain a bunch of avoidance and healing taken increased by 10% for 10 seconds. Only occur every 90 seconds on that. And there's also some fall damage reduction as well as a nice little bonus. Again, this is just kind of a free addition to the cape. The avoidance is probably a little less valuable on tanks specifically. Sometimes it's good depending on what pushed you below that. There are certain tank busters or, you know, hits that tanks are scared of that are avoidance reduced. Generally, there's not as many though. So the avoidance seems like it's more valuable for, you know, DPS players. But, you know, the healing taken increase is certainly nice. So this is just a small defensive bonus on top of having the stats of a cape. So, you know, you're going to be wanting to get your hands on this, of course, but it probably is more impactful for DPS players compared to tank players, just relatively. And then we get to the weapon. This is the very rare weapon that's the other part of that 2-piece that I mentioned down here with the contract. This is just a double crit weapon. So, you know, your fist weapon user, I think it's monks and of course demon hunters, they both kind of like crit. So having a double crit weapon is not bad. And then it also has a chance to do, you know, an additional dot on your targets. Again, that is reduced. It's not a huge dot, but in general, this weapon is just really, really nice anyways for the specs that can use it because they already like crit as well. And the damage is just kind of a benefit. So you'll probably want to get this fist weapon if you are one of the 2 specs that can use it. Yeah, there we have it, guys. Those are all of the interesting tank related items coming in season 1. Hoping to see some more buffs at some point before launch. We will have to see, but let me know what you guys think of these. Are there effects that you are really, really interested in? What is your favorite? Let me know down in the comments below. And while you're down there, make sure you hit that subscribe button for more tank, mythic plus, and raid content in the new expansion. Otherwise, thank you all so much for watching. Thank you to my amazing Patreons for their support, and I'll see everyone in the next video.